Well, a very warm welcome, everybody. Glad you've been able to tune in. This is the third now of three lectures we've had during this autumn period. I'd hoped to do a bit more than I'm going to do. I'd not realised quite how much material I had to hand, but I'll explain that a little bit further later on. So we're talking about Samuel Davies and the trip that he made to this country in 1654. Actually, now Ian's muted himself. Perhaps you could unmute him and pray for us, Ian, and then we'll get on. We've got some pictures to go with everything. So perhaps, Ian, you're able to do that. Okay, thanks.
Our Father and our God, we thank you so much for your word and your truth. We pray that you will bless us this day. We thank you for Gary and for the work that he's done and for the background research and all that is involved in this. We pray that you will glorify your name as we listen to this lecture today. Pray that this may encourage us in our spiritual lives and in our work and witness. Pray that you'll continue to give us wisdom, and especially with the work of the library in the coming days, and may all be done to the glory and praise of your great and holy name. May we be better men and women of God as a result of our hearing of the works of God through these men of old. Hear our prayer and sanctify to us all that you would do for us as we commit ourselves into your hands for Jesus' sake. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Okay, this man you should recognize, some of you, Samson Occam. We talked about his trip to this country a little while ago. He came in the company, he was a Presbyterian minister, Native American, and he was in company with a man called Nathaniel Whitaker, a congregational minister, and it was prompted really in part by George Whitefield. George Whitefield knew the situation on both sides of the Atlantic, and he prompted that. But it was Eleazar Wheelock, the Congregationalist preacher and educator, who actually organized it. So Occam and Whitaker, they traveled then extensively in England, also in Scotland, and got as far as Ireland. Occam preached 300 or 400 sermons during that period, and there were large crowds almost everywhere that he went. They raised over £12,000, which is more like £1.5 million today. And the funds were used not quite in the way that it had originally been intended, but for the founding of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. Now, it turns out this was not the first trip of this kind. About 12 years before, a similar trip had been made with similar aims, and this was by another Presbyterian minister. I don't know if you know the name of Samuel Davies, born 300 years ago this year, 1723 to 1761. He later became the principal of what became Princeton University. And he was accompanied then by an older Irish-born Presbyterian, the revival leader and the friend of Whitefield. You might know this name, Gilbert Tennant. Gilbert Tennant, 1703 to 1764. So this earlier trip then was intended to raise funds, but this time for what was then called the College of New Jersey, but that later became Princeton. The money they actually raised was used to put up Nassau Hall in Princeton. Now they collected much less than Occam and Whitaker. It was more like £3,000 all told, which is more like £500,000 in today's terms. But it was enough for them to put up a place that, of course, in future days would become a real centre for faithful Reformed teaching. Tennant and Davies were obvious candidates for this trip, although they did consider others. The Congregationalist, I thought I had a picture of him, but don't worry. Ebenezer Pemberton was one of the possible candidates, but he had a lot of trouble in his congregation and couldn't leave them at that time. Davies's roots, this is important, were in Wales, hence the name Davies. He grew up in Delaware, And then when he was 24, he came to Virginia. He quickly established himself as a significant figure in the life of the denomination and beyond that as well. He was involved in correspondence with several back in Old England, and he was widely respected, and that made him an ideal candidate for the trip. However, as a family man, he would be sorely missed at home, and he did weigh it up for some time before he eventually concluded it was the Lord's will to travel. Now, we know a lot about the trip because Davies began to keep a diary in June the 2nd, 1653. And he kept that up until his return to New England, February the 13th, 1755. So throughout 1754 and also a little bit before, a little bit after. Unlike Ockham, he didn't abandon his journal partway through, but there are some few gaps where either he just wasn't able to make any entries, or sometimes the record has been damaged. Like Ockham, Davies travelled into Scotland, but he himself didn't go any further, although Tennant went to Ireland. Some who Ockham met also met Davies, but obviously there was a change in the 12 intervening years. I think what we get, what piques my interest is that you get a sort of a snapshot of how it was, the religious scene, if you like, in Britain at these particular times. Davies's diary, which is contained in 2 small leather-bound volumes, was edited and published in 1965 by the American history professor George W. Pilcher. So one volume, the one that takes you from, I think it's July the 2nd, 1753 to April the 28th, 1754. That's in Union Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. It's not the original copy. It's been copied out several times down the years, and obviously the ravages of time have had an effect to some extent. And then the other volume, which I think goes all the way from 1752 to 1755. Anyway, it's a larger volume, and that is in Princeton and has fared better and is practically complete. So Davies's diary reveals that he left New England November 18th, 1753, and he reached London then on December the 25th, on Christmas Day. He remained in London until May the 7th, when he headed north for the General Assembly in Edinburgh. He spent 4 months away from London in different parts of England and Scotland before he returned to the capital in October for his final weeks in England. He set sail for home November 1754 and arrived 3 months later. So he'd been absent for a little over a year. Pilcher points out 2 significant factors that hindered Davies's endeavour. First of all, in New England, Presbyterianism, as you may know, was split into 2 factions. It was all to do with their attitudes to revival. And so you ended up with 2 rival synods, one in New York, that was the one that Davies belonged to, and then one in Philadelphia. There was an Episcopalian called William Smith, who at the same time as Davies and Tennant were in England, was also there seeking funds for a college in New York. So those were factors from home. But then at the same time in England, Presbyterianism, again, as you may know, was riddled with Arianism, and evangelicals were more likely to be found amongst the Baptists or in the Church of Scotland. So as I say, I wanted to consider the whole trip in this one paper, but it's not going to be possible to do that. So we're just going to concentrate on his time in London. Well, mostly on his time in London. We're going to start back in New England. So he begins his diary July the 2nd, 1753, and in the opening pages he explains some of the background to the decision to make the trip, the decision to leave behind a sometimes unwell wife. His wife's name, I believe, is Jane. Yeah, he calls her Cara, though. I need to check that. Yes, his wife anyway had 3 young children to look after. There was also, of course, his congregation in Hanover, in Virginia, and he didn't take his decision to leave lightly. He confides to his diary that he had 6 reasons for coming to Hanover in the first place. He came for health benefits. He came to be hardened by opposition. He came seeking greater popularity. He's very honest about that. A better acquaintance with the world and its learning. He wanted to supply a needy congregation, certainly, and he wanted to become growing. He wanted to grow in his usefulness. Now, those same factors he felt were enhanced then by the trip to England. So entries for September 1753 describe his travels to Philadelphia and to Princeton. In Princeton, he defended his thesis on the Trinity, and he successfully received his M.A. He also went to New York, to Elizabethtown. At one time, he hurt his leg rather badly. He thought, well, that's it. I'm not going to be able to go to England. But he managed it in the end. On October the 1st, he met a fellow minister who was suffering from depression, and he was able then to counsel him. He stayed with John Brainerd, the lesser-known brother of David Brainerd. And so he saw something of the work that was going on amongst the Native Americans. Pilcher actually gets the two brothers confused. David Brainerd died in 1747, so he can't be David Brainerd who Davis meets, but it must be John Brainerd. Interestingly, if you know the story, it was Brainerd's expulsion from Yale that led them to found Princeton. That's part of its story. Anyway, Davis rode on then to Philadelphia for the synod with Brainerd and 2 other ministers, Elihu Spencer and James Brown. At the synod, he was able to obtain promises from Brainerd and others to supply his pulpit in Hanover while he was away. After the synod, he went to a presbytery at Fogg's Manor, and he stayed with the widow of his old tutor, Samuel Blair. He preached at the ordination of a new minister, and a week later, then he fell ill. That, combined with the premature birth to the wife of his friend John Rogers, with whom he was staying, meant he had to change his plans, and so he went back to Philadelphia. You've got a 2-week gap in the diary then. I think when he was not well, he wasn't making any entries, but he says he preached some 20 times in Philadelphia in that period. He fears that most of those sermons were of poor quality. He moved then 19 miles downriver to Chester for a short while, and then back to Rogers again in Philadelphia. While with Rogers, he made excursions to see relatives in what is called the Welsh Tract. And finally, then he came to Reedy Island to wait for his ship. The ship took longer than expected, and that led to a little bit of frustration. But by this time, Davis had been away 10 weeks, hadn't seen his family for 10 weeks, and yet they hadn't really begun. So, sorry, that's Nassau Hall I mentioned. That's what the money that was raised led to the building of. So anyway, he eventually set sail. Saturday, November the 19th, 1753. They're on the ship, the London. They set sail 5 in the morning the next day. Davis left with what he calls a kind of pleasing horror. He was glad to be on his way, but the thought that he may never see his family or his country again was rather a daunting one. So the journey then from New England to Old England, November 20th to December the 25th, 1753. So by the afternoon of November the 20th, the ship was out in the Atlantic. Davis was suffering the effects of seasickness, and this went on for some time before he began to feel better. He enjoyed reading an account, a 1749 account of a shipwreck, and also, I suppose it's the delivery that he enjoyed most, a man called Joseph Bailey, and he read sermons and other materials as well. They tried to have public worship on the ship as often as they could. The beginning of December, the weather worsened and Davis suffered again. Not only sickness, but he had toothache as well. That was one of the problems of the 18th century. No very well developed dentistry. There was a lot of rain, and at times they made little progress. Davis and Tennant tried to bear witness to the crew. They were a rather godless bunch. They weren't warmly received. By December the 14th, the ship was approaching land and soundings were frequently taken. And shortly after this, they sighted Beachy Head and came into the Downs, as they're called. And so they came around the coast of Kent. They enjoyed observing what they could see from the ship, Dover Castle, Margate. They began to sail up the Thames, and on December the 22nd, they cast anchor at Gravesend. They went on then past Woolwich, past Greenwich, and they cast anchor at Deptford, next to a man of war. And on December the 25th, then, as I mentioned, they came as far as the Tower of London. Because it was Christmas Day, all the churches were ringing their bells. It's been a nice thing to hear. They firstly visited, as Ockham and Whitaker would do, the London merchant and dissenter Denis de Bert. Denis de Bert was of Dutch descent, but was at this time serving as an agent for the Connecticut and Delaware assemblies. Later, he would be elected a London agent for the Massachusetts Assembly. So Davis's time in London, then December 26, 1753, through to January the 31st, 1754. So among their earliest visitors were the important independent or Congregationalist ministers, Thomas Hall and Thomas Gibbons. They also met a Methodist, I think he is, Robert Cruttenden, who had been a minister, but by this time had become a merchant. But he spent his days supporting the dissenting cause in what ways he could. He gave them a gift of some books. They spent time with George Whitefield. George Whitefield had just come back from Scotland. Whitefield offered them the use of his home, but they declined. And the reason for that, and the reason why they only met him in private, was because there was a lot of antagonism amongst dissenters against Whitefield because he was an Anglican, and they didn't want to muddy the waters. Tennant had been quite low from the time of their arrival, but when he met Whitefield again, that really stirred him up, and he had Davies up praying half the night because he was so excited about meeting Whitefield once again. They also met a Mr. Lloyd. Pilcher suggests that was Samuel Lloyd, a cousin of the wife of Charles Wesley and a legal advisor to John Wesley. On December 28th, they climbed the monument. I don't know if you've ever been up the monument. You get a wonderful view from there. It's, of course, in memory of the 1666 fire of London. That day, they took lodgings with a Mr. Thomas Cox and his family in Winchester Street in the city of London. That's where they were based. On the Lord's Day, December 30th, Tennant went to hear the uncrowned patriarch of dissent, Dr. Samuel Chandler. He was the man to go and hear. Davies preached for Thomas Hall's assistant, Richard Winter, in Moorfields from Isaiah. And they were joined then at lunch by another independent assistant minister, Samuel Morton Savage. Also, he had a trainee minister with him called Ellis. I'm not sure who he was. In the afternoon, Davies preached in Great East Cheap. It's hard to say. He had a sermon on Jeremiah 31, 18 and 20, which he liked to preach. And that's what he did on that occasion. This was for the Baptist, High Calvinist and Antinomian, Samuel Dew, D-E-W. Davies felt that he got on better in the afternoon. In both cases, he was surprised at the smallness of the congregations. He was used to congregations in America that were much larger. Tennant preached for Hall in the afternoon, and Davies spent the evening with a turkey merchant. I thought, when I first read about a turkey merchant, I thought it was somebody who sells turkeys, but it's somebody who travels regularly to Turkey in the course of commerce. So this was Eleazar Edwards, a Baptist. Next day, Davies called on William Kerr, the third Marquis of Lothian. He wasn't in, though. En route, he enjoyed seeing the King's Palace, Westminster Hall, and what remained of London's walls. And there was the relatively new Westminster Bridge, but I don't know where that's gone. No, I think, oh yes, I missed these. So these are, there was a picture of Eleazar Pemberton, as I thought. And then this is, the other one is William Smith, the man who was also in the country seeking funds for Anglican causes. So there's Westminster Bridge. I've got them out of order, I guess. Sometime anyway around, I can't see them on it, but it's around that time. He remarks that he saw beggars everywhere. He was surprised at that. So Tuesday, January 1st, 1754, Davies hears Chandler at Salters Hall. He's impressed with his skill, but not sure that that was what he would call experiential preaching. On the Tuesdays, independent and Baptist ministers would meet in the Amsterdam coffee house. I haven't got a picture of the coffee house, but perhaps that will help you to sort of picture how it must have been. So Davies goes to the Amsterdam coffee house. He was often going to be there in the next few weeks. So there he met Samuel Price, who was Savage's co-pastor, a colleague of the late Isaac Watts. He dined at Trinity House, which many of you will know is where the lighthouses were run from and maintained in this country for many years. In the evening, he joined large crowds listening to Whitefield. Whitefield was preaching on the barren fig tree at the tabernacle, and he later joined Whitefield at home. Of that sermon, this is interesting what he says. He says, the discourse was incoherent, yet it seemed to me better calculated to do good to mankind than all the accurate language discourses I have heard. So I thought it was interesting insight in what it must have been like to listen to Whitefield preaching. January the 2nd, he finally met Lord Lothian. He was impressed with his humility and he was encouraged by his sympathy. Alexander Melville, the 5th Earl of Leven, joined them for the afternoon, and like Lothian, he was cautiously optimistic about this project. They spent the evening with the long-serving Presbyterian minister of Little St. Helens, Edward Godwin, and again, he was positive about the whole thing. Next day, they breakfasted with Chandler. Then they met the important independent minister, John Guise, however you say it. But he was quite negative about help then. He didn't think there was much hope. In the evening, Davies was with Gibbons and Cruttendon and de Bercht again. Tennant was with Hall. They tried to keep up their times of prayer together, but they agreed to go to different prospective donors. Davies again had toothache, which was debilitating, so he stayed at home on January the 4th. He wrote a long letter to his wife, who he greatly missed. Meanwhile, Tennant visited the Presbyterian Francis Spilsbury, who ministered at Salters Hall for some 40 years. He visited the influential Seventh-day Baptist Samuel Stennett, the pastor at Little Wild Street, and also the independent Thomas Bradbury. Bradbury was a bit of an eccentric. He liked to go around singing the roast beef of old England. That was what kept him happy. January the 5th, Davies visits, and again, a mildly eccentric fellow, Thomas Bowles, the great print seller. He gave him a map of London and another gift as well. He went on to dine with the London agent of the Massachusetts Bay Province, Jasper Mordowit, and also Mordowit's brother, Israel Mordowit, both very anti-Calvinist, but so they're not obvious supporters, and yet they seem to be happy to give him advice, going to the king, talking to the SBCK, and so on. January the 6th, Davies hears the Presbyterian Thomas Newman preaching on Psalm 116, verse 6. So this is an Arminian preacher, but Davies enjoys his preaching. In the evening, Davies himself preaches for Gibbons then. Not for the first time, Davies met a descendant of Cromwell and also a descendant of Sir Henry Ashurst, who he calls the friend of the ejected ministers. Tennant was preaching for Chandler. Next day, they visited Newman, who was quite negative about the whole thing. They also tried two booksellers, John Oswald and James Buckland. He wasn't at home, though. Davies also spent time that day with Winter. Didn't like Winter's rigid Calvinism, he says. He again heard Whitefield with Prophet in the evening. And such visiting then continued the rest of the week with the Baptists, Eleazar Edward, Samuel Stennett and his son, the bookseller John Ward, and Josiah Thompson, who was the minister at Unicorn Yard. Also then they met the Lutheran preacher, Friedrich Ziegenhagen, court preacher, and with Gibbons, Guise, and Dr. David Jennings and Jabez Earl, the Presbyterian and George Stretfield of Pinners Hall. They also met from Pennsylvania, you'll know this name, Thomas Penn. Thomas Penn was the second son of William Penn, as in Pennsylvania. They also met the colonial agent Richard Partridge, the MP William Belchier, the medical practitioner John Belchier, and also a Mr. Gibson, or is it Lawson? I think it's Mr. Lawson, actually, at Debrest. So Sunday, January the 13th, Davies listened to the London Scots Presbyterian Robert Lawson. In the afternoon, he preached for Gibbons, and he spent the evening with him. Tennant preached for Gibbons in the morning and Stennett in the evening. Another week of visits followed then. Lawson, Whitfield, Cruttendon, Gibbons, Edward Jones of Cheapside, the independent minister Samuel Pike, who you might have come across. The Presbyterians, that's Stennett for you. Missed him. So that's Samuel Stennett, who will come into the story again later. And then these two, Nathaniel Lardner and Benjamin Grosvenor, both of whom Davies loved being with. He really enjoyed their presence. He also met a medical practitioner called Benjamin Avery. That's the first man there. He was working at Guy's Hospital. He was a leading dissenter. At St. Dunstan's Coffee House, they met a friendly William Smith, who we mentioned earlier, the provost of Philadelphia College. Sunday, January the 20th, after a night of consternation, Davies preached then for the Presbyterian William Pryor. They dined at the home of a philanthropist called Captain John Simpson. In the afternoon, Davies heard Tennant preach a simple sermon that he hoped was not too blunt. I think that was Tennant's style, to be rather blunt, but there we are. In the evening, he heard Pryor was impressed with his oratory. By the end of the day, he got himself again rather depressed, and he was cheered by being with Tennant, but he wrote, "I'm afraid I shall do little good in this city. The congregations are so small that it is enough to damp one's zeal in preaching to them." He spent the next day working on a petition for the college, and in the evening, he was with Gibbons, with a Mr. Llewellyn and Stennett's son. Next day, they were at Chandler's with Smith, and it appears this man, Michael Schlatter, you can see there on the right, he planted a church in Germantown in Philadelphia some years before. The matter of Gilbert Tennant's sermon against an unconverted ministry was raised. You might remember this, that Gilbert Tennant preached this sermon against the unconverted ministry, which it seems such an obvious thing to us today, I suppose. Well, of course you want your minister to be a converted man, but it was a very controversial thing to say at that time. And so 13 years before this, it had been preached, but it's raised, of course. Now they're in the country, and some people are still not happy with it. It wasn't an easy time. They came away perplexed, but enjoyed a helpful sermon from Richard Rawlin in Pinners Hall. They went on to the Amsterdam Coffee House and then to Ward's, returning home with no clear idea what to do next. The next day, they tried to persuade Chandler of their Catholicity then, but he wasn't completely won over, although he invited Davies to preach the next Sunday for him. That day, they went to see Presbyterian Dr. Samuel Lawrence, who also advised them. They dined with the Independents Price and Savage, who were, again, quite negative. Bradbury in the evening was a bit more positive. January 24th, they were able to gain the support of Guise, Lardner, Pryor, and Lardner's Socinian assistant, George Benson. Next day, they gained the written support of Chandler, Stennett, Rawlin, and a hesitant Lawrence. Spent the evening with Bradbury, and the next day was a rest day for correspondence, although they did dine with Bowles, the print seller. So on the last Sunday of January, Davies preached his Jeremiah 31 sermon with some freedom for Price, and he dined with him, and he was moved to think that he was preaching where John Owen and Isaac Watts had preached, and other greats at that in previous times. In the afternoon, he preached again for Lawson from Revelation. In the evening, he listened to the independent minister Philip Furneaux. In the final days of January, he was with Pike, Grosvenor, Lawrence, Rowland, and the Baptist, John Gill. I want to have a picture of John Gill just to remind you that they did meet those great men. The Independent, John Richardson and John Walker, tutor at the Academy of Zephaniah Marriott, met them as well. They all agreed to support the subject. They were less successful with the Independent ministers Samuel Price and William King, who discouraged them. Davies noticed how talkative King was. Savage was also now negative. January 29th, Davies met Jennings, who again signed up in support, and that day he had Earl at the Salters Hall. He and Presbyterian Minister John Barker both signed in support, as did Minister and Medical Practitioner John Allen, and Benson as well, with some quibbles. Davies met both of those at Hamlin's Coffee House. It was Tuesday, and all the Presbyterians were at Hamlin's on a Tuesday. Tennant was over at the Amsterdam Coffee House. Davies joined him there in the evening and was glad of the support of the Independents John Halford and Thomas Towell. Davies also dined that day with Gibbons and a hosier called Thomas Holmes. He was meeting not just ministers but businessmen as well, who at least had some money. How are we for time here? Okay, so let's move on. He's still in London. It goes on like this really until the end of April. Early in February, he endeavours to get the support of the London Scottish ministers. So he gets support from Presbyterians William Cruikshank and John Patrick. He enjoyed a walk through St James's Park. He was surprised how large St James's Park, I don't know, is. I'm not sure of what's happened to it since. He also had support from Presbyterians Andrew Kippy, who'd studied under Doddridge, and the Scotsman Thomas Oswald. He dined with John Guise and his son and fellow minister William Guise. He met the popular Arminian Baptist Joseph Burrows, and the fourth, Edmund Callamy. You know, when you deal with Callamy, you have to remember there's four of them altogether, one after another. Sadly, he says about Edmund Callamy, 1697 to 1755, pleasant, but has imbibed the modish divinity. So either Arian or something approaching that, sadly. February the 3rd, Davies preaches with freedom for Cruikshank and with confusion and fear of man for Chandler, with whom he drank tea at a Mr. Adair's before returning home, full of doubts about the success of his mission. Next day, he interacted with the influential Presbyterian John Denham, although Denham was suffering with gout and had to put him off rather. He went on to meet Prior again, a learned and ingenious man. He gave Davies a guinea for the college. They got on well together. He dined with David Muir, an independent and a Scot, and also with another Scottish independent called Mitchell. They were both happy to sign up. He also visited Dr. Jennings again and Whitfield's good friend, the independent minister, Edward Hitching. They all readily signed. Davies spent the evening with Towell, who was keen to correspond and urged Davies to publish more. And one or two sermons had been published by this time. Some of David's, and some of his poems as well. 5th February, busy day. Davies again heard Rawlin preach at the Pinners Hall. Then at the Amsterdam Coffee House, he added three more independents. John Milner, who ran a school in Peckham. Peckham was a village in those days. Mr. Thompson, and Samuel Hayward, another independent. He went with Gibbons to dine with a Charles Buxton, who gave him 5 guineas for the project, unsolicited. He later dined again with Mauduit. Davies felt by this time they had 60 names, and for him, it was a remarkable smile of providence, and he thought, well, we've done enough. But Tennant disagreed. He thought they ought to press on and do some more. So press on they did. February 6th, Davies spent that day with Stennett, who introduced him to influential people, including Archibald Campbell, the 3rd Duke of Argyll, a member of the Privy Council, and through him then Thomas Hay, the 9th Earl of Kinnoul and Viscount Duplan, Lord of the Treasury. So he was moving in high circles there. Sunday, February the 10th, Davies preached at a vacant Baptist church in Spitalfields, and with unusual freedom at Shakespeare Walk, dining that day with Savage. He complains of a cough that he says he'd had ever since he got to London. Next day, he finally spoke to Denham, who was rather negative. He also spoke to Jennings, who showed him some interesting scientific experiments. He was once again with Savage in the evening. On the Tuesday, he was at Salters Hall again, this time to hear the Presbyterian John Barker, Dr. John Barker. Davies judged the Presbyterians. It's interesting. He says the Presbyterians have got the more learned men, but many of them are not sound. Whereas he felt the independents were better, at least from that latter point of view. At Hamlin's coffee house that day, he signed up Finot, then dined again with Mordowich, who promised money. He also met a man that day who he calls the notorious deist Samuel Dicker, but I can't find much about Samuel Dicker, I'm afraid. Wednesday, February the 13th, was wet, and so they were mostly at home writing letters, which, as you might expect by now, made Davies all the more homesick once again. He saw Towle in the day, he had Whitfield in the evening. Next day, it was off to Stennett's, but there was no progress with Duplin. Davies also met the Antinomian Baptist, John Brine. You might know that name, John Brine. He dined with Adam Anderson, a clerk at the South Sea House, one of the founders of the colony of Georgia. He'd worked with SPCK. In the evening, he met another Thompson. I think this time it was a Baptist. He was certainly a latitudinarian, and Davies sought to dissuade him from his position. On the Friday, Jabez Earl gave him 5 guineas for the college, but Spilsbury didn't give him anything. Spent the evening with Cruttendon talking about their poetry. They were both poets. He dined again with Bowles, father and son. Davies was in low spirits once more. It kind of helped to hear that some people were saying that his sermons were rather rigidly orthodox. But the next day, he was in a better mood, and they decided to print and distribute 500 copies of their petition. Davies was with Lardner, Pike, and Guise, who gave about 7 guineas together. He also spent time with Mordewitt's son-in-law, James Wright. In the afternoon, he spent time preparing to preach the next day. He reflected with amazement on how many ministers he'd met since he'd arrived in England, but he was sad that he wasn't finding the time for private devotion that he had in the past. Once again, he was homesick, but he trusted in God's providence, and so he wasn't too despondent. Next day, he heard Jennings in the morning, then preached for him with Freedom in the evening. He found Jennings very entertaining and instructive, and mentions his theories on the tree of life. Can't go into that now. The week, February 17th, 23rd, was again taken up with passing on the printed petitions and making more visits. Tennant's sermon, which I mentioned against the unconverted ministers, was being reprinted now and being handed out. So that was working against them. However, to their surprise, they were given £50 by the MP William Belcher, a churchman. Davies comments on him, that seems to have no sense of religion. So he didn't seem to have any sense of religion, but he gave him £50. So that's good. Davies also visited influential people such as former Bank of England Governor William Hunt in Hackney, another Turkey merchant and MP, Stamp Brooks Bank, another former bank governor Alexander Sheaf, Turkey merchant Benjamin Bond Sr., political philosopher Thomas Hollis, the Dutch merchants Joshua van Neck, and so on, lots of others. On February 24th, Davies preached at Little St. Helens at 7 a.m. He says, the earliest that ever I preached in my life. Have you ever preached at 7 o'clock in the morning? Yield yourselves unto God. That was his message. He also preached twice for Thomas Oswald from John 3. Final days of February were spent firstly again in Hackney, and then he went down to, or up to Stoke Newington. And, oh, hang on, that's Hitchin. I mentioned Whitfield's friend, Edward Hitchin. And then up to Abney House in Stoke Newington. He was really so pleased to sit in Isaac Watts' former study and to just soak in the atmosphere. He met Sir Thomas Abney's daughter, Elizabeth Abney, who was still living in the house. February 26th, he visited the House of Lords, and the next day he preached a charity sermon to a large congregation with many ministers present at William King's, and he found that quite an ordeal to do. So March the 4th, Davies confesses that he had but little heart for business. He went to see the bookseller James Waugh, an independent dissenter who printed the works of Watts and Doddridge, and also his father-in-law, Thomas Field, a prolific publisher himself. Davies discussed the case of the dissenters in Virginia at Mordowitz. He notes that an old rival of his, Peyton Randolph, had arrived in London, and he was expecting opposition from him. Next day, they determined to publish a fuller account of the rise and present state of the college in order to help their cause. This proved difficult because, as he says, Mr. Tennant's style and mine are so different. That day, he was once again at the Amsterdam Coffee House seeking support. March the 6th, he heard Halford preach a charity sermon in Chandler's Meeting House. He thought the content was very good, but the delivery wretched. He says he met Halford on the way in, and he expressed the hope that God would help him. And that just made Halford burst into tears. It made Davies reflect on what a responsibility preaching the word is. That day, he also met former churchman turned dissenter Richard Jackson, not entirely committed to their cause, but willing to give 10 guineas. There was also a banker called, we haven't got Pelham. Sorry, I don't know where he's gone, but that's Ebenezer Blackwell anyway, the banker, a wealthy supporter of Methodism. Davies assumed it. Funny how you can make mistakes, isn't it? Davies assumed he was a dissenter, though he's actually a churchman, and Blackwell assumed that Davies was a Moravian, which was wrong as well. But they got themselves sorted out in the end. Davies writes, I have been more than usually anxious this day about my dear wife. Oh, that I knew how she is. I find that neither time nor distance can erase her image from my heart. He also notes the unexpected death. That's why I wanted to have a picture of Henry Pelham for you, but he's gone somewhere. I don't know where he's gone. Henry, I can't go back now, can I? Oh, I can. Yeah, so Henry Pelham was the Prime Minister, but he died rather suddenly. And on March the 7th, then Davies met Theophilus Lobb, who'd been a minister at Haberdashers' Hall, but had retired and was now devoted to medicine. And he also met John Patrick again. He comments, Davies, on his own despondency, fatigue, anxiety, but also his thankfulness for Tennant. He notes that day Stennett had been awarded a DD. March the 10th, Davies preached in the morning for Gibbons, and at the end he himself burst into tears. So moved was he, and the congregation was moved as well, including Cromwell's great-grandson, who gave him 3 guineas for the college. They went after to Stennett's to dine with him and his brother, his fellow minister Joseph Stennett. I think we had him, didn't we? That's Joseph Stennett there on the left. They spoke much of experimental religion. Davies preached for Stennett in the evening. Things didn't go as well as in the morning. He spent the evening then with Stennett's son, a pious, ingenious youth. On March the 15th, Davies drew up a petition for the dissenters in Virginia and took that to Avery for corrections. Head was full of the death of the Prime Minister, Randolph being in London, other things that made him rather anxious for his fellow dissenters back in Virginia. Stennett was influential in court, and so Davies appealed to him, explaining the Virginia situation, promised to do what he could. Stennett that day had been waiting on Thomas Pelham Holles, the first Duke of Newcastle. This is the Prime Minister's older brother, and actually he succeeded him. Newcastle comes next in the Prime Ministers of the country. He'd gone there to sympathise with him. The next day, Davies spent the evening with Cruttendon, who read him his dissertation in favour of Watts's psalm versions. Around this time, he also spent an evening with Hall and spoke with the Anglican William Hervey. William Hervey, of course, is the brother of James Hervey, and we won't cover it this time, but Davies eventually met with James Hervey. Davies mentions he'd recently heard Henry read at Salter's Hall on enter not into judgment with thy servant. It had too much of a legal spirit. And then he adds this, so that's the Salter's Hall. So they would use that to meet in. And then he says, I could not help thinking of a pun I've heard of a minister who preached a sermon upon these words. Salt is good, but if the salt have lost its savour and so on. And when he was desired to publish it, he said he believed he would. and dedicated to the preachers at Salters Hall, for they wanted seasoning. So that gives you a little insight into what was going on in Salters Hall as far as Davies was concerned anyway. We're running it fine here. So that same day, Davies dined at the Baptist Stead home in company with Robert Cornthwaite, his minister, then a Seventh-day Baptist and a Socinian, sadly. Some days before, he'd spoken to a man called Grant, a minister in Northamptonshire. Davies writes, he has no learning, but he is a very solid, judicious and pious man, and I am told popular and successful in his ministry. I'd like to know more about that man, but I couldn't trace anything. March 17th, Davies preached in the morning for Lawson at the Founders Hall, later at Unicorn Yard for Josiah Thompson Baptist. He also preached his Jeremiah 31 sermon with more than usual freedom and solemnity for Mitchell at Hitchins Meeting House, largest crowd he'd yet seen. Next day, he was once again with Morduit, who'd been at the House of Commons, obtaining the repeal of a clause in a bill that might have been injurious to the dissenters. There was still some confusion about who should follow Pelham as Prime Minister. Davies was longing for news from home. March 19th, again at the Amsterdam Coffee House, thanked by Guise and the governors of the charity school in Bartholomew's Close for his charity sermon at the end of February. He went on to Hamlin's Coffee House and the Presbyterians, again not really very warmly received, probably because they were doctrinally lax, I suppose. On the Saturday, Davies preached in the evening for Stennett and a very small congregation of Seventh-day Baptists who seem, says Davies, very very serious people. Next day, he preached at Deptford to a number of poor, honest people. Stayed there with Joseph Solway, a timber merchant and sugar refiner. On the way back, he called in on Milner and his school in Peckham. Following Sunday, he preached for two gentlemen of very different sentiments. In the morning for Guise, and then in the evening for Benson, the Presbyterian. So diary entries are missing then until about April the 7th, when he preached again for Gibbons and Benson. He and Tennant are very pleased to be able to report back to America on how successful they've been. That Sunday, he's also in Hackney, where he hears Hunt preach. Also preached in the pulpit where William Bates had been the minister. He stayed with Bowles again. This time he also visited several influential men. He spent an evening with Benson in friendly debate on this whole matter of subscribing to articles of faith. A letter came from his dear brother, John Todd, with news of his family. It threw me into a passionate ferment that did not soon subside. Oh, how kind is God to me and mine, writes Davies. Another Sunday he preached for Towell and a man called Walker, so on. So it goes on like this. It's difficult to know how much detail to include. Anyway, eventually, the General Assembly was about to meet in Edinburgh. And so on May the 7th, they began their trip up to Scotland. And so they went obviously through England, but then they spent some time in Scotland. Tennant went to Ireland. They came back. I think Davies came back to London, then went off again very quickly to East Anglia. Well, we haven't got time to cover that this time. Perhaps we can do it another time. But let me come to his final weeks in London, October 1st to November 17th, 1754. So back in London then, he heard from various people back home and from Tennant then, who was still in the west of the country. As he began to contemplate his return home, he was gratified to be going back, but he was sorry it was going to be a winter passage. Tennant returned to London shortly after this. Davies was encouraged to see him again and to know of his success. Davies continued to have many preaching opportunities. Some he preached for before. New people like Andrew Gifford at Eagle Street and the independent Meredith Townsend in Stoke Newington. On the evening of October 27th, he heard the successor to James Foster, the Baptist Charles Bulkeley. Tolerable, he says, but anti-evangelical. And then this most interesting occasion, they finally secured an interview with John and Charles Wesley. And it's interesting what Davies says then. He says, notwithstanding all their wild notions, they appear very benevolent, devout, and zealous men. that are labouring with all their might to awaken the secure world to a sense of religion. And they are honoured with success. But I'm afraid they're encouraging so many illiterate men to preach the gospel will have bad consequences. I heard one of them last Tuesday night, but he explained nothing at all. His sermon was a mere huddle of pathetic confusion. And I was uneasy as it might bring a reproach upon experimental religion. The despised Methodists, with all their foibles, seem to me to have more of the spirit of religion than any set of people in this island. That's interesting. It's a reluctant admission. You can see the problems, isn't it? Well, I have not left time to discuss this, but you might like to discuss it in some other way somewhere else. So he began his departure November the 18th, 1754, coming first of all to Gravesend in the Charming Anne, captained by one Richard Baker. He'd sailed, Tennant had sailed separately before. Davies's idea was he could sail directly to Virginia and get home quicker, although he wasn't looking forward quite reasonably, it transpires, to the journey itself. 32 people aboard, but none of them really a companion like he'd had on the way across. They reached the Downs November 24th, but they had to put in at Plymouth on November the 30th. He was glad not to be suffering seasickness, but at first anyway, he spent a lot of time reading again, preparing his sermons for the press. After a fruitless foray into the Channel, they had to return to Plymouth, and then seasickness came back with a vengeance, I'm afraid. Such little progress after 3 weeks at sea was frustrating, but he was thankful that they hadn't died in the storms, as several had at that time. He tried unsuccessfully to solicit funds in Plymouth. On December the 8th, he preached to the crew, but they were unaffected. He was appalled at the blasphemies and the imprecations of this wicked rabble. December the 14th, even though they were in harbour, there was a terrible storm and all the ships were bashing against each other, and they were thankful to survive that. So it was only on December the 30th that they finally got out into the high seas, and there were several violent storms in the next few weeks, and Davies often despaired of life, but he finally got home February the 14th, 1655. So there's a snapshot. There might be an opportunity for some questions or subjects to discuss. I don't know. There we are.